Hi, and welcome to this review of the March 2020 Advanced Financial Management exam. My name's Andrew Mower and I'm a tutor at Kaplan Financial. So during this session we're going to look at some AFM exam technique and how to approach the exam. We're going to look at an overview of the March 2020 exam. We're then going to focus in on question 1 and try and put some of that exam technique into practice. And then we'll do a little wrap up with a summary of the key things you need to remember ahead of your exam. So let's just have a little reminder about this exam. You've got 3 hours 15 minutes to complete it, and that's working out at 1.95 minutes per mark. So always useful that to allocate time to each question, just to make sure you're not overrunning. Do remember as well now that all 3 questions are compulsory. Previously in this exam you used to have a choice in section B. Now you have to do all 3 questions, which takes away any decisions that you might have to make. So in some ways makes life a little bit easier for you. In terms of some examiner tips for this paper, make sure that you're always applying your knowledge to the scenario. You're not just what we call learning and churning. You're not just remembering things and then reciting them into your answer. You really need to try and tailor your answer to the question that's been asked of you. And a good way to do that is making sure you read the scenario carefully, you pick up the key points, make reference to the company, make reference to the scenario and what's happening, and bring those into your answer and make it a really tailored and applied answer. Make sure you practice your time management. One of the big issues in this exam is people spending too long on certain parts of questions. So be really strict with that 1.95 minutes per mark. And make sure you read the question carefully. You want to be answering the question that's been set, not the question that you wish had been set. So make sure you read it, because sometimes just misreading a little word or interpreting it slightly incorrectly can veer you off in a really dangerous direction. So make sure you're reading that question carefully. Make sure that your layout is really good in this exam. It's so important. If you make it nice to mark, you'll score more marks. So you need to lay out your numerical workings really clearly. Show your workings. If you are referencing separate workings, for example, working 1, working 2, make sure you then put them in a logical place and label them up so they're easy to find for the markers. You also want to make sure that you're being succinct, but also maintaining a professional tone when you're writing this exam. So they don't want bullet points, they don't want lists of things. They want you to be writing short, well-structured paragraphs and sentences that have a professional tone to them. You also will see that you'll get 4 professional marks in section A of this paper. And this usually takes the format of a report. So if they ask you to do a report, you need to do a title. So just a really quick summary of what the report is about. An introductory paragraph, not much in that at all, so probably 2 or 3 lines, just outlining what the report covers. Then you do your report as you usually would answer a question. Make sure you have time to do a conclusion at the end as well. So wrap up your findings. Should they, shouldn't they do this project? Should they, shouldn't they invest in this company, or whatever it might be? And then you probably want to show your workings in a separate appendix. Now, traditionally, an appendix comes at the end of a report. So all your calculations you'll label at the end of that. Personally, I don't mind that being up front if it means then that you can refer back to the numbers. It just saves you having to leave several pages before you guess where you're going to put your numbers. But either way, make sure your numbers are in an appendix. So any calculations you do them in a separate section. Let's think about the March 2020 exam now. So as always with AFM, we had 3 questions. Question 1, the 50 marker, was all about an acquisition. And in there we saw the report format. And that's the one we're going to go into a little bit more detail in a few moments. Question 2 was a risk management or hedging question that was fairly tricky. There were elements of it where there were some easy marks to get, but then there was the section on margins which a lot of students struggled with. So definitely worth looking over that question at some point. But again, always remember there will be plenty of achievable marks in this exam. You just need to make sure you're focusing on those ones. There are always going to be some hard ones. You just need to make sure you're getting those easy marks in the bag before you start chasing those really tricky marks. Question 3 was about investment appraisal. Again, relatively tricky, but I had a few nice bits to it. So make sure you review that investment appraisal one, which was question 3. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on question 1 from this exam. And within this question, it was split into 3 parts, A, B, and C. Part A was all about behavioural factors. Part B was a report on an acquisition. And part C was how we then finance this offer. I've just put on the screen there the number of marks available for each part, and then the corresponding time as well, if we're basing it on 1.95 minutes per mark. Again, make sure in the exam that you're being really strict with your timings and you're not overrunning on any particular bits, because it's so easy to do this in the exam. Another good bit of technique to use here is you can answer these in any order. So if you look at this and you think actually financing the offer is quite a nice 8 marks, which I think actually it probably was, I'd be looking to maybe even do that first. So before I get stuck into a 36 mark bit, I might look at that and go, part C, okay, how do we finance this cash offer? As long as it doesn't rely on anything that you've done before it, yeah, you could always do that first. It's a good way to get your confidence up if you're looking at the other parts and thinking that they're a bit harder. What you don't want to do is run out of time on something that you know, and there's nothing more frustrating than finding that you've run out of time and you had so much more to give. So just think about that in the exam. Just think, right, what is the best order for me to tackle this question in? And it may well be that you do one of these sort of smaller parts first, just to get those marks in the bag. Okay, I've got question 1 from the March 2020 exam loaded here within the software. You guys are able to view that exam as a PDF with relevant screenshots, and then have the blank software alongside it in order to practice. So that's all on the ACCA website. Definitely worth doing that just to get used to the functionality of the software. So it won't look exactly like this, but you can still replicate it in a way that is still useful for you. Now in the exam, they'll give you the exhibits here, and you've got plenty of information ahead of this 50 mark question. So you're always going to get quite a bit of detail going on there. It's really important, therefore, we look at the requirements first, just to work out what they want us to do in this question. So then when we are reading these exhibits, we have in the back of our mind what they've asked us to do. So let's open up these requirements first then. And we've got here, if we just scroll up a little bit, there we go. Part A was about the behavioural factors. So there were 6 marks going for that. So these why companies may have been valued highly. That is very much a discussion part, so I'd be looking to answer that within the word processor. So you can just click word processor there, and then you can just set that up with a little part A. You then have this report. Now the report is sort of the main bit of this question 1, and they're asking you to do some calculations, so additional value, the WACC, the total value they'll gain from doing that. So these first 3 parts, so the 20 marks worth there, are all calculations. So those first 3 parts are calculations. I therefore would be looking to do those bits in an appendix. So I'd be looking to use the spreadsheet to do all those calculations, and just really clearly label B, part 1, part 2, part 3 as an appendix. This part 4 then is more discursive again, so assessing the strategic and financial value of the acquisition, and then you've got to discuss the estimates and assumptions, 12 marks. Again, make sure you leave enough time for that, because I always really like those sort of wordy bits, especially the assumptions. I think there's some quite nice, easy marks in there, so make sure you do leave enough time to be able to do that. AFM students often get sort of bogged down with the numbers, and you're working so hard to try and make those perfect that you forget to leave enough time to do the chatty bits. As I say, I think there are a lot of easy marks in there, so 12 marks for that. So I'd be doing that bit in the word processor. So that final bit of the report, I'd be doing the word processor. And the professional marks, so 4 marks there. Don't forget what you need there is a title, an introduction, the main report, a conclusion, and then separately you'll have your appendix, which would sit nicely within the spreadsheet. So I'll structure that. I'll show you how I'll set that up in just a few moments. You then had part C as well, which were these factors. So the factors that may determine how the offer will be financed, and then you had a little bit of gearing in there as well. Right, let's have a think about part A here then. So it was these behavioural factors that may have led to the value being too high of this company. Now, as I mentioned, we'd want to do this in the word processor, so we'd want to open that up and just make sure you clearly label which part of the question you are answering. So we're just going to put here part A, and then we can get cracking with that. Now, there are parts of the exhibits here which are going to give you little hints, so it may be worth having those open and try and sort of juggle your screen a little bit to make sure that you can see what's necessary. But I'm just going to give you a few pointers as to what you could say. In terms of the mark scheme for this, there were 1 to 2 marks available per point. So if you are chasing 6 marks, which this bit was, as you can see up here, yeah, if you had 3 well-explained points here that were really applied to the scenario, you could get your 6 marks fairly easily, I think. So not too bad a question at all. The big thing was just making sure you're actually answering the question. So it was about behavioural factors. Lots of students going off talking about how to value companies, and or if they've used the dividend valuation model, it might be valued too highly or whatever. It's not about that. It's about these behavioural factors. So more sort of the psychology behind investing that have caused it to be too highly valued. So just as a few ideas that you could have discussed, you'd want to write these out in full paragraphs, by the way. So let me just jot that down. So full paragraphs. So they don't want bullet points or anything. And make sure you apply them to the scenario as well. So it does say businesses such as this Matravers Tech. So drop in that name every now and again, and that'll be fine. I'm just going to give you a little list here just as an idea, a few ideas that you could have discussed. Again, remember, in the exam, you need to write these in full paragraphs. You can't just do a list, otherwise then you're not going to get many marks at all. So you could have discussed here things like the fear of missing out, which I'm sure you know is FOMO. Probably don't write that in the exam, but this idea of fear of missing out. So investors think, oh, this seems like a really good opportunity. I want to buy these shares. So a lot of people, if there's been a lot of press about it, if it's been a very discussed launch of these shares, or if there's a lot of stuff in the news about them, then people think, oh yeah, I really want to get involved with that. And it's sort of quite a it's quite a fashionable industry, isn't it? So it's a fashionable investment. It's technology, so people think, oh yeah, this is up and coming, I want to be part of that. So you could discuss that as well. It's especially this tech company, quite a fashionable investment you can mention. The asking price could have had an influence. So the fact that they have suggested a price has an influence on whether people think it's good value or not, or how much they'd be willing to pay. If it was just a blank canvas, I'm sure people would come to their own conclusions about how much they'd be willing to pay for a share. But the fact that they have suggested a price can impact people's judgment. Because it is available for sale, there is a lot more positive information. So because they know that it's for sale, they'll be pushing a lot of positive information about this company, which may influence people's judgment as well. You can then do this, there's other things such as confirmation bias. So if people have an opinion on the company and they think, yeah, this is a really good company, I like them, they'll only see the good news about them. Any sort of negative press, they think, that's fake news, or that's just bad reporting, I don't believe that for a second. Anything good about the company, and they think, yep, I told you, I knew this was a good company, they're great. So you get that with confirmation bias. And then there's this idea of herd instinct as well. So if everyone else is buying the shares, people think, right, I need to jump on board with this. And equally, if everyone starts selling the shares, people think, everyone else is selling them, we need to get rid of those. So that's sort of human nature. Stick with the masses, and you tend to protect yourself. So the idea of herd instinct you could bring in. So these, again, just to emphasize, these are just ideas. What you'd want to do is you'd want to explore, like I say, sort of probably 3 or 4 of these in the actual exam. So fear of missing out, and you just want to explain that in more detail as a full paragraph, pad that out. Only 2 or 3 lines you can get away with, absolutely fine, and that will get you a couple of marks as long as you've explained it well. So that was part A, and again, just a few ideas for you to talk about in there. Again, just pick 3 or 4 of those probably in the exam, expand them, and you'll be absolutely fine. Right, let's move on to part B then, where the majority of the marks were for this question. And it was this report that they've asked us to do. Now, as soon as I see report format, you know that there are going to be these 4 professional marks coming your way, and these should be really straightforward to get. So it's asking for the format, structure, and presentation. The great news is now, because you guys are doing this as a computer-based exam, your handwriting is no longer a factor, which is great news for a lot of people, myself included, if I were doing this exam. So we can then just structure it nice and easy, get those 4 marks, and we're good to go. So as soon as I see a report, it's probably a nice idea just to set this up actually. So you need a title, so that can just be a few words. So just a few words, sort of summarising what the report is about. So it'd probably do a report into, and then you can do that. You then want and underline that, make it look nice and formal. We then want a little introduction. So let's say, I don't know, say 2 to 3 lines. This report seeks to is a nice start to an introduction. So with the introduction, you're just outlining really what these requirements are. So you're just looking at those requirements here, and you could say this report seeks to calculate the additional value, the WACC, and any potential gains, and assess the strategic and financial value to West Parley of this acquisition or something. So you just need to get something down that just summarises what we are doing within this question. We then will do the main report. So I quite like report findings. So in here we are going to do part 4. So that is going to be this bit of the question, as we mentioned earlier. That's sort of the wordy bit and the sort of the findings of the report, I suppose. So that's part 4 of the question. You then have a conclusion as well. So based on this report, and then you can give a little bit of advice there as well. So advise whether you think it seems a good idea or not. So based on the numbers you've got and the discussion you've made, do you think it's a good idea? So they're the things you want to do. And as I say, you just want to make sure that have these as little headings. It's always a nice idea. So just break up your answer. So get your title, introduction, report findings, which is where you're going to do that 4th part in this particular question. And then just a conclusion. And by the way, I'd probably do, again personally, I'd probably only do 2 or 3 lines on that conclusion. So just a really quick one. Now you'll notice here we're missing parts 1, 2 and 3, aren't we? And they are reserved for the appendix. So what I'd then be doing is opening up my spreadsheet, and I'd be going right B, and I'd be saying appendix. So you can then refer to your appendix within your report findings. So you can just say, this is as can be seen in the appendix, etc. Now, don't forget, it's a little bit tricky, isn't it? Because as well as doing this report, you are also doing an exam. So you need to make sure it is still really easy to mark. So very important that you keep it neat for the markers. So we are just going to keep and stick to the exam structure of parts 1, 2 and 3. So at that point in the appendix, I just label those up. So you just have part 1, part 2, part 3. And then you can go ahead and do those calculations as necessary. If you're not used to the software, you probably want to just have a little play around with it. So there are a few little things that you just need to get used to. Don't forget the markers can see your workings, so you can so they can see the formulae, I should say, within a cell. So you don't need to go about showing that separately. But you still do need to clearly show your workings. Make this really neat, especially with the more complex workings. Still show how you've got there and what's going on, and they'll make it really easy to mark then as well. And if you do a working, so say working 1, just make sure you label it up as well, so that they can easily see what's happening. So that would be where you do all your calculations. Again, have a little play around with the software, get used to the functionality before your exam. In terms of the this part 4 then, so the strategic financial value, and then it said including a discussion of the estimations and assumptions made. There are actually sort of 4 parts to that question, aren't there? And as I mentioned earlier, 12 marks is a lot. So they've asked you for the strategic, the financial value, so 2 bits there, and then the estimations and the assumptions made. So there were actually 4 parts here to that. And the way that the mark scheme was split out, so within your report findings, you had here, so you had your strategic value. So you could do these as subheadings. I think that's a good idea. Financial value. You then had your estimations and assumptions. So I would have those as subheadings within my answer. Maybe make them metallic or something, just to show that these are the little subheadings, and then get a few points in there. I actually think that makes it, as well as making it a lot easier to mark, it makes it easier for you to come up with ideas, because rather than just 12 marks, you've now almost got, it's split into 4 bits, isn't it, which makes it easier to come up with ideas. In terms of the marks, there were 3 to 4 marks going for that bit. There were 2 to 3 marks going for this bit. It was then 3 to 4 for your estimations, and the same for your assumptions. So plenty of marks available, and if you went just, if you aimed for roughly 3 points for each, you'd be doing pretty well. So 3 ideas under each of those things, and that'll spread out those marks quite nicely. Okay, so that's how I would set up this report. So I'd have my title at the top, introduction, your findings, where you do any sort of wordy bits of the exam question, which in this case was part 4, and then I have my conclusion at the end, just a little summary, whether or not I think it's a good investment. If it's an investment appraisal, it might just be whether or not we should go ahead with the project, or whatever it might be. And then separately, I will have my appendix, clearly labelled which part I'm doing, show all your workings, keep it really neat, and in that way you'll be in a really good place to pick up loads of marks. Finally, part C, which was about these factors as to how they should offer for this company. So how they're going to finance that, and then the level of gearing as well for this part C. So I think that this was actually a really, really nice part. So again, you'd be looking at going into the word processor, part C. Very similar thing to earlier, so 1 to 2 marks per point. And you'd want full paragraphs, so don't go doing bullet points or anything like that. So full paragraphs, and you need to try and apply it to the scenario. And again, the key thing here was this offer. It was a cash offer, so a lot of students missed that in this exam. So it was a cash offer, so students talking about share for share exchanges and things, but it wasn't about that. It was about how are we going to finance that. So the factors, and then and hence the level of gearing. So there are some really easy things to say in here about the availability of the finance. So that could be a factor. So how quickly we can get it. Any covenants that we might have. So do we have any existing covenants within our business? You could talk about the director preferences. So do they prefer having lots of debt? What's their risk attitude like? You can mention that. The security, so do some forms of debt require security and others don't, so that could come into it. Tax relief, you've got things like the impact on cash flows. You could talk about what industry, so the industry norm, so what that usually happens, what happens there. Loads of things. Pecking order theory as well, you could have dropped in here, which you may remember is about using up any retained earnings you got first, then moving on to your debt finance, and then finally onto equity if necessary. So you could bring a few of those in. Again, just a few ideas there of things you could have talked about. But again, 8 marks. So if you got 4 of those and explained them well and applied them properly, 2 marks per paragraph, and you've got your 8 marks. So plenty of easy things to be said in there, I think. Just make sure it's neat. Space out those paragraphs as well. Lots of short, concise paragraphs, just 2 or 3 lines each, and you'll be absolutely fine. Okay, just to wrap up then, some key advice for this exam. Make sure you're reading those questions really carefully and going through that scenario, understanding it, and bringing that scenario into your answers, applying your knowledge to the scenario. Make all your answers really neat, make your workings easy to follow, make your calculations nice and tidy. And one of the most important things is making sure your time management is good. And a great way to do that is to keep practicing exam standard questions to time. Look at past exams, do them to time, be strict, and keep practicing. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your exam.